Shalom, everybody, and howdy. This is Rabbi Menashe Bovit, and I'm here to give you a little bit of little Torah before this Shabbos. This week's Torah portion is Parshas Vayikra. Parshas Vayikra, and it's also the beginning of the third book of the Torah, which is Vayikra, which means and called. And in English, this book is called Leviticus. Leviticus sounds like the name of some Roman general, doesn't it? Like, here comes Leviticus. But actually, because it's dealing with the laws of the Levium, the Levites, and a lot of that is dealt with in this book of the Torah. So that's how it got the name Leviticus. But I call it Vayikra. I like the Jewish name for it. So Vayikra is the third book of the Torah. We know the first book of the Torah is Bereshis. It means in the beginning of God's creation. Bereshis. The second book, it's called Genesis in English. Second book of the Torah is Shmos, which means names in Hebrew, but comes out as Exodus in English because it deals with the exodus of the Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, of the Jews from Egypt. And now we're getting into the third, Vayikra, which means and called, which is Leviticus, is what it's known to the general population. So to give a quick update as to how we got to where we're at, in Bereshis is the story of creation. It starts out with Hashem's creation of the physical world. We're not going to get into the details about that right now, but it introduces also the beginnings of the Jewish people. It starts with Avram Avinu, with Abraham. Hashem chooses Avraham, to begin a people who will become what are going to be known as a Mamleches Kohanim, a nation of priests. You see, our mission as Jews, we have a mission. There's a purpose why there is a special people in the world. It doesn't mean that we are better than anybody. We have been chosen to be a vehicle to bring God's message to God's creation. That is the purpose of the Jewish people. The purpose of the Jewish people is not to be a whining liberal. The purpose of the Jewish people isn't to eat Jewish-style food. The purpose of the Jewish people isn't to be an arm of the Democrat Party. None of that is real. The purpose of the Jewish people is to be part of this Mamleches Kohanim, a nation of priests, to be, in a sense, Hashem. We say Hashem means the name because we don't pronounce Hashem's name. That's a traditional way of speaking about God. To be God or Hashem's agents in this world. Let's call sales reps in this world to bring God's message to this world. So it begins with Avraham Avinu. Avraham is chosen by Hashem to be the beginning of these people. We see that there's a process of refinement that takes place. Avraham has a son, Yitzchak, Isaac, who will then carry on that message, that tradition, that shlichus, that mission in this world. And then Yitzchak, Isaac, he has two sons. One son is named Esav or Esau. One son is named Yaakov or Esau. We see Avraham had two sons also, Yitzchak, which was the one who was to carry on the message, and Ishmael, who ends up becoming the ancestor of the Arabs, according to our tradition, and according to their tradition also. And then, so once again, Yaakov is the son who is to carry on this tradition, not Esau. Yaakov then goes on and has 12 sons. These becomes the founders of the 12 tribes of Israel. And they are now living in what's called Eretz Canaan. And the story goes on to talk about that the 11th of the 12 sons of Yaakov, of Jacob, his name is Yosef, or Joseph. And Yosef comes into conflict with his brothers because he is a gifted individual who is favored by his father for a number of reasons, but primarily because his father loves him so much because he is the child of Rachel. Now remember, we got back up a little bit in the story. Yaakov fell in love with Rachel, love at first sight, and wanted to marry her. Her father, Lavan, who's also, by the way, his uncle. They did a lot of marriage within the family in those days, and he married his cousin. So he said, you want to marry my daughter? You got to work for me for 7 years. to earn the privilege of marrying her. And so he does that, and Laban tricks him. He marries him instead to her older sister, Leah. Now, once again, people find these stories hard to believe. How could he trick him? Well, without going into too much detail, they have what's called a Mishta. Now, last time we saw the word Mishta, we just recently celebrated Purim, and in the book of Esther, everything takes place at a Mishta. A Mishta is a drinking party. Alcoholic beverages are consumed in large quantities at a Mishta. And in a marriage celebration, a wedding celebration, of course, we did a lot of drinking, and so it's pretty easy to figure out what happened, that Laban got Yaakov very drunk, and so therefore he would not be able to understand or recognize that the switcheroo had been done to him. She wore a veil during the ceremony. When they went back to the marital tent, it was dark in there, and he was extremely drunk, and so therefore he did not know that he was cohabitating with the wrong girl. He wanted to marry his beloved Rachel. Instead, he got married to her sister Leah. He then had to work another 7 years for the privilege of marrying Rachel. Now, later, the Torah forbids a man from marrying two sisters, but this is before the Torah is given. So there's a little insight in a lot of things we're going to talk about in the subsequent weeks when we talk about the Torah. But in any case, so he loves Yosef very much. Yosef's a very gifted, good-looking individual. He has these precocious dreams, which could be easily interpreted that he sees he will at some point have supremacy over his brothers, and so he's very threatening to them. Yaakov makes him his brother's supervisor, even though he's only a teenager and they're adult men. They see him as a threat, and they determine that he needs to, at one point they want to give him a death penalty, but then they say, no, we can't kill him. They end up selling him into slavery to a passing caravan. He ends up in Egypt because of his great talents and his ability to understand circumstances and adjust himself to circumstances. He rises to high positions from when the first time he is sold into slavery in the house of Potiphar. Potiphar's wife, who would be the ancient founder of, or foundress, I guess we could say, of the Me Too movement. And so she tries to seduce him. He's very good looking. And she tries to seduce him. He rebuffs her amorous attempts, and she accuses him of rape then, because she's insulted. He ends up in the Huzgau, ends up in prison. However, he interprets dreams. And so when they in prison, he meets the other prisoners who are with him. One is the chief baker to the Pharaoh. One is the chief wine steward to the Pharaoh. He interprets their dreams correctly. The chief baker is executed, while the chief wine steward is restored to his initial position. He says, put in a good word with me with the Pharaoh. Actually, the rabbis say it caused him to have 7 years extra in prison, but we're not going to get into the details on that because we want to go quick today in what today's message is. And so while he is in prison, the Pharaoh has this dream, a bizarre dream, where he dreams there's 7 nice juicy cows who are then followed by 7 emaciated cows that eat them up. There's 7 nice big juicy stalks of grain. Next dream. It's followed by 7 withered, ugly, horrible-looking stalks that eat up the nice stalks. He doesn't know what these dreams mean. He brings in all his wise men of Egypt, and they can't figure it out. They can't interpret this dream. And so the wine steward remembers, there's this Jew boy in prison named Yosef, and he's good at interpreting dreams. So they schlep him out of prison, and he interprets the Pharaoh's dream. And not only that, he has holy chutzpah, and he says, listen, Pharaoh, there's going to be 7 years of famine that are going to follow 7 years of prosperity. So it looks good right now. There's prosperity now, but it's going to be followed by 7 years of deprivation. So what are we going to do about it, Pharaoh? Well, you need to appoint someone who's really smart, who knows how to be a great administrator, who's going to come up with a plan to save the country. And so you can put away all the goodies from the 7 years, and then what will happen is then in the 7 years of famine, everything will go fine because you have prepared appropriately for it, which is a message that could probably people should have thought about that in our modern times. But once again, we're going to go past that right now. So in any case, He appoints Joseph to the top position in Egypt. Underneath, he's the top leader after the Pharaoh in all of Egypt. And so, therefore, he saves Egypt. Now, while this is going on, there's a famine in the whole region. It hits Eretz Canaan, which is what Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, is known as Eretz Canaan, the land of the Canaanites before that. And so there's a famine in the land, and Yaakov determines he needs to send some of his sons to Egypt to procure the correct provisions to be able to survive. They show up in Egypt, and they don't recognize who they're talking to. This is actually Joseph. This is actually Joseph, their brother. And he's very struck by this. He puts them through a number of tests. When we go into those Torah portions, Torah is right in a cycle. We go in a circle. We'll come back to them before you know it. So right now we want to focus on, we're going to quickly get to this week's Torah portion. I'm just going to giving you the background. So what takes place is he eventually reveals himself to his brothers. They, of course, are fearful there'll be retribution for what they did, but he understands it was the hand of Hashem, just like we know in the story in the next book of the Torah we're going to get to in Exodus or in Shmos. Hashem, God redeems Israel with Yad Chazak of Israel, the two, a strong hand and outstretched arm. Doesn't mean a giant arm comes down from heaven and plucks them out. It's the metaphor for Hashem's intervention in the affairs of human beings. And so therefore, he understands that God sent him ahead to Egypt to make sure his family survived. And he reunites with his brothers. He reconciles with his brothers. They come down to Egypt. They're given the land of Goshen where they could raise their sheep and cattle and goats and all. That's what they were, pastoralists in those days. And so therefore, everything looks very nice. But remember, Egypt's not our home. It's only temporary. And because it's only temporary, what happens is later on, a new administration, an anti-Semitic, I use that term, administration comes into power in Egypt, just like here in the United States. We have an administration today that's very hostile to authentic Jews and authentic Judaism and to the state of Israel. In terms of leadership, we don't know what's going to come next, right? So in Egypt, it goes from days when there's a very friendly Pharaoh. Remember, the Pharaoh in all of Egypt is celebrating when Joseph and his brothers reconcile and reunite. But then later, there is a Pharaoh in charge who hates the Jews. So I use the term Jews, even though they would have been not known as Jews in those days. They'd be Bnei Israel, the children of Israel. So outsiders known as Hebrews or Ivrim. And so, in any case, things get bad for the Jews in Egypt. They are enslaved. They are put to backbreaking labor. They were abused. The Pharaoh was fearful, and he puts forth a proclamation that the Jewish boys, upon birth, must be killed. Remember, there's only boys and girls. You either have a choice, boy or girls. There's only two kinds of people in the world, right? And so the Jewish boys are to be killed. So there's a kid named Moshe who is born. He's not known as Moshe yet. He gets his name, actually, through his rescue. And what takes place is his mother and his father, who are from the tribe of Levi, they determine that somehow we have to save our son. And what they do is he's a baby, newborn baby. They put him in a little boat. They take a little basket. They put tar in it. They send him afloat in a river filled with poisonous snakes and crocodiles and alligators, crocodiles, hippos, other dangerous creatures. Sounds like an odd way to save your child, but it worked because the Pharaoh's daughter discovers him and she rescues him and she names him Moshe because she drew him out of the water. And so therefore, he's raised in the very house of the Pharaoh who wants to kill the Jews. He's raised as royalty. Now, at one point, he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Jew. The commentaries say actually he already murdered the Jew, and in righteous indignation, he strikes down the Egyptian. The matter becomes known. He understands that because there's actually bad Jews even there. And there's a couple of Jews who are fighting. He tries to intervene. They say, what, are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptians? Later, we learn this is Dasan and Aviram. These are the two wicked Jews who are in the midst of the Jews even after the exodus from Egypt, and they're troublemakers against Moshe, Dasan and Aviram. Now, the character of Dasan, remember the movie, The Ten Commandments, Charlton Heston movie? Remember Edward G. Robinson playing David? Yeah, Moses, where's your God now, Moses? Yeah. Okay, that's based on that same character. Okay, well, so Moshe has to go into exile because Dasan's going to rat him out. ends up in Midian, where modern-day Saudi Arabia is. He ends up rescuing these shepherdesses who are being abused by shepherds, and that's actually unusual for there to be female shepherdesses. Apparently, Yisro, their father, doesn't have sons, and they're being abused by the more powerful, strong male shepherds. And Moshe intervenes and rescues them. They run home and say, "Dad, this Egyptian rescued us," because he looks like an Egyptian. So he rescues them. Yisro invites him into the household. He gets a job with Yisro, and Yisro marries his daughter Tzipporah to Moshe. And those days, the intermarriage thing is a little bit different. Okay, we could just say in those days, there's no formal conversions in those days. Anybody who believes in Hashem, I guess, is considered a Jew. So she obviously came to believe in Hashem. So he marries his daughter Tzipporah, which would actually be translated as Lady Bird, to Moshe. And at one point, though, Hashem reveals himself to Moshe through a burning bush that is not consumed, and tells Moshe, "I've chosen you to redeem your people." Moshe, being Anam Mikol Noam, means the humble of all people. He says, "I'm not up to the task. I'm not the guy. There's got to be somebody better than me." But he's the guy. We know the whole story. Then we go into the whole book of Exodus. That's what we're into right now. And Shmos, the whole story of Moshe going. Once again, the people, they're very reticent about accepting his message because we're going to talk about this in just a little bit. They are steeped in Egyptian culture. Assimilation, there's a process called cultural diffusion, in which a subculture is influenced by the dominant culture and likewise. And so therefore, just like today's Jews are very assimilated and don't even understand what it means to be a Jew, in Egypt, in slavery in Egypt, the Jews had also been absorbed into Egyptian ideology, thinking, and culture. And so therefore, they're very reticent about Moshe's message. It's very difficult for them, and it remains difficult along the way, because even after they're redeemed from their slavery. This is important stuff to get into, because we're getting close to Pesach right now, so this is all going to plug in. And in a few moments, I'm going to get into our Torah portion and give you a message from our Torah portion. But it's important to get the background before we get there. So even in Egypt, they're very reticent, and they fetch and they complain, but Hashem redeems them from Egypt with Yad Chazak of his Roin Natuya, with a strong hand and outstretched arms. He afflicts the Egyptians with Makos, with the plagues that demonstrate that even though Egypt is the most powerful nation on earth in those days, and the Pharaoh calls himself a god, that the God of the universe is actually truly in charge. And human beings can't stand up at all to the God of the universe when he intervenes in the affairs of human beings. And that's what takes place. So the Egyptians are humbled through the 10 plagues. The Pharaoh's heart is hardened. I need to talk quickly about that. What does that mean? That Hashem hardened his mikaved, or these in mikasha. There's different terms used for either making heavy or hardening the heart of the Pharaoh. And this is because the Pharaoh is a wily politician. After being hit with these plagues, he may not really understand, or might even really truly believe that these plagues are coming from some kind of God of Israel or anything like that. But it might just seem that he makes a correlation. I persecute these people, and this bad stuff happens. This guy is saying, this Moshe guy is saying that his God is making this stuff happen. So it might be in my best interest, regardless if I believe this or not. Because remember, he says, "Mi Hashem." Who's Hashem? When Moshe says that Hashem sent him, the Medrash says that the Pharaoh has this book of known gods, idolatrous gods. He looks up, he says, "I don't see him in the book of idolatrous gods," so he doesn't even know who Hashem is. But in any case, he might just make a correlation and say, it'd be in my best interest to get rid of these people. It seems as long as I'm holding these people, bad stuff happens. I'll get rid of them, and the bad stuff will stop. And so I'm just going to get rid of them. And so instead, Hashem, in a sense, blocked that perception. In other words, put him in a situation where he would not be just making a decision based on expediency. We would have to make a moral decision. Actually make a moral decision. It's just like B.F. Skinner had his Skinner box, where he put the rats in the Skinner box. And Mr. Rat, if he presses this lever, he gets a yummy. He presses that lever, he gets an electric shock. Well, Mr. Rat learns he doesn't like electric shocks, so he presses the lever for getting the yummy. But Mr. Rat is not really exercising higher judgment. He's not making a choice of good over evil. He's not making any moral choice. He just knows he doesn't want electric shocks. He wants yummies. So the Pharaoh wants yummies, doesn't want electric shocks. So we'll learn to just get rid of them. So instead, he gets numb to the electric shocks. That's the reason why the Pharaoh's heart is hardened. But anyway, Israel's redeemed from Egypt. Hashem extracts them from Egypt, and now they are in the Midbar. They're in the wilderness, and they're wandering around, and it's a constant up and down thing. They have the revelation at Mount Sinai, at Har Sinai, the revelation of the Torah, the giving of the Ten Commandments, and they go from that right away into the golden calf thing, right? Because they freak out. Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't come back from the mountain quick enough, and they freak out, and they think they need an intermediary, and they start with the golden calf thing. They right away fall. You know why? Because there's a teaching that they're in what's called mochen the katnus. They have a contracted consciousness. They still don't understand what it means to be free. They're still thinking in the Egyptian slave mindset. It's hard to extract yourself from that. So they end up, there's a constant ups and downs and ups and downs. We're going to see in the whole story, they ascend to a high level and they fall constantly. This is a metaphor for us as human beings, us as Jews. This is what happens all the time. Because if we live in this society, we're part of the society also, for all the good and for all the bad. And it's something, and for many Jews who are distanced from Torah, they only have the messages from this society that they're part of. And because the society today is run by extremely wicked people, I mean, people who want to convince you that a boy can be a girl and a girl can be a boy. They want to convince you of all kinds of that your value as a human being, if you have pale skin like I do, you don't have a lot of melanin, yet you have white privilege, and that you are evil, and that you are a racist, and even you can't even get out of being a racist. You just are. The only solution is to become an ally to this intersectionality thing and all this other insanity. So all of us are somehow touched by this. The Torah is the solution, of course, but we're all touched by this. If you don't have any Torah, that's all you have. If you have fake Torah, like what goes on in liberal congregations across the country, which, once again, I've mentioned this many times. If the first time you're hearing me, you haven't heard me say this. On Shabbos, we lift up the Torah. We lift up the Torah when we finish reading the Torah. The Torah is the scroll it's written on with the handles. We have Torah, Moshe, right? We say this is the Torah of Moshe. Well, in these Reform and ironically called conservative congregations or reconstructionist congregations, I call it the form, confusative, and deconstructionist movements. And these temples or synagogues, when they lift it up, they're actually lifting up the New York Times. I think the New York Times is their Torah. That's where their message comes from. So in any case, if you're very confused, you're still in this mochen katnus, this contracted consciousness, and it's hard to extract yourself from that to get the mochen de gadlus, an expanded consciousness, which is directed by the das of the Torah, the knowledge of the Torah. So in any case, let's get to our Torah portion. So I want to give you a lesson there. I'm going to finish up for today. I'm going to give you a lesson that I think is, I just got to give some background to get there. It's the first time I'm making this kind of a video that I'm posting. I hopefully that you'll come back and you could experience far more of far more of the messages that I wish to bring to you. That's why I'm doing this thing. Also, I'll let you know now before we even get into our Torah message for this week's Torah portion that you can join me on Zoom for Shabbos services. I have services on Zoom on Shabbos, and you could reach out to me at belleroserabbi@proton.me. Or if you prefer using a Yahoo email, you could get to me also at belleroserabbi@yahoo.com. That's BELLEROSE at either Yahoo or proton.me. Okay, so reach out to me if you would like to be included in our Zoom services. Our Zoom services are a learning service. What you're getting here today is a little bit of a sample of how I conduct the services. We don't just drone away. We don't do just a silly, please rise, please be seated. In the Parsha this week, like your typical quacky, silly reformer conservative rabbi. it's not like an Orthodox service also, in which it's all going to be on Hebrew. This is a Torah based message that is constructed for everybody. Anybody could get something out of it, even if you have no background in Torah. It's a teaching, learning service. In the middle of the various different prayers, it's in a sense, it's been modified to be a teaching service. So it's selected prayers from the service in which I teach during these prayers to teach you why we're saying that, what the meaning of these prayers are. And so it's very accessible. And even if you have no background in previous Jewish learning, you will be able to get a lot out of it and enjoy it, even though we're doing a lot of it in Hebrew. So, once you get connected, become part of our group, we'll make sure you have the correct Siddur, correct prayer book to use, and you'll be instructed along the way. So even if you have no background, you'll be able to plug in. So let's get to this week's Torah portion, Vayikra. It starts out, Vayikra. Okay, Vayikra. That's the first, it's Vayikra. Now, it doesn't say Vayikra el Moshe, right? It doesn't say who's calling to Moshe. Usually, most things say, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. Hashem spoke to Moshe lemor, telling him, and it says, Daber el bnei Israel, speak to the Jews and tell them, right? So usually that's kind of how most of the things are introduced. Here, it says just Vayikra, and called to Moshe. It doesn't say who's calling. And it has in the way it's written, the word Vayikra has the letter Aleph in it, but the letter Aleph is a little miniaturized, little inky-pinky little Aleph. So I'm going to share a teaching with you that I think is very, very important for where we are today in the world. So you see, in Vayikra, it doesn't say who's calling, and it has just a little tiny Aleph. Now, why? Okay, let's get into that. Now, the teaching I'm going to share with you comes from the Chernobler Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem of Chernobyl. He was born, I think, approximately in 1730. So he lived in that age of enlightenment. And during that period of time, the Jews were living in Poland and in the Russian Empire. And he lived in the town of Chernobyl. The town of Chernobyl was a town in the Russian Empire. It would be located in what is called Ukraine today. The Jews living in the Russian Empire were very oppressed at times. Most of the time, they're very oppressed. And they were oftentimes felt their Judaism was getting somewhat disconnected because an elite had formed amongst the Jewish establishment in which you had to be a Torah scholar to be an expert in the Talmud to have any status in the community. And on the other hand, there was already emerging what would be known as later the Reform movement, because there were Jews who were now becoming part of a so-called Jewish Enlightenment, and this was pulling Jews into a secularism and taking them away from Torah. So there was two poles that were kind of serving to distance Jews from the sweetness and deliciousness of the Torah. And so therefore, Torah is supposed to give you joy. And so therefore, a guy came on the scene that we call the Baal Shem Tov, master of the good name. And the Baal Shem Tov started, now remember, he didn't create anything out of thin air. What he did is he emphasized the joyousness of Judaism, and he took concepts from what we call Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism, but he made them put them forth in a very accessible, psychologically and emotionally and spiritually accessible manner, which would bring joy into people's lives. And he started a whole new movement, which became known as the Hasidic movement, or Hasidus, which was actually ironically called that because it was meant to be an insult. The opponents of this movement called Hasidus were calling them Hasidim, which means the pious ones. They were calling them that sarcastically because they thought they were anything but pious, because these people were just so joyous. And they're in a celebratory kind of Judaism. And some people, unfortunately, found that very threatening. So anyway, the man who started it was known as the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name. He had three main students, and then they had their students. So this is from the third generation. Sometime I'll give a whole class here on this format about how Hasidus came into being. And so we see that the third generation, there's a Rabbi Menachem. He lived in the town of Chernobyl, and the Twersky family is descended from him, by the way. And so he wrote a book called Ma'or, means like the light of the eyes, and so therefore his teachings are just really could turn you on and give you a lot of insight. And what he says about this Torah portion, Vayikra, is he gives a metaphor here. He says, why is it that it doesn't even say clearly that Hashem is calling? It doesn't say Vaydaber Hashem. And why is it a little tiny aleph? And he likens it to this, that we have to reach out to people in a way that we can get to them. I mentioned earlier that in Egypt, the Jews were steeped in Egyptian culture. There's a teaching, the rabbis say the Jews are at the Mem Tes Shari Tuma, at the 49th gate of spiritual impurity, that one more step, they would have been so imbued, and we talk about the swamp politically, okay, there's a spiritual swamp also. They would have been totally sunk in the swamp. They would have been lost. They were so steeped in the Egyptian idolatries and culture. They actually believed, like the Egyptians did, that the Pharaoh himself was a god. They believed it at one point. They actually had accepted their lowly position in Egyptian society. That's what happens. That's what assimilation does. Now, there's good assimilation, like assimilation into the best of America, but there's also negative assimilation where you lose your Yiddishkeit. And that's what we're talking about here. And so they were so steeped in spiritual darkness. The question is that he asks is, why didn't Hashem just like pluck them out of Egypt, give them the Torah, and set them down in Israel, right? Hashem could do anything, right? Hashem's the master of the universe. Hashem's not limited by time or space. That doesn't mean anything. Hashem has no boundaries. Ein Sof. Hashem has no dimensions, no boundaries, no limitations. Even our concept or thinking about Hashem, we say Hashem means the name. That's what we say instead of saying Hashem's name out of respect. Hashem just means it's just a Jewish way of saying God. God has no limitations. Even our concepts of God are limited by the fact that we're human beings and we can only understand so much. Even the greatest human being has a thing called a brain, gray matter inside there. So no matter how powerful that gray matter is, a human being is limited in terms of what a human being can understand, even understanding about God. So having been steeped so deeply in the Egyptian idolatrous culture and having accepted that, remember they're in this called Moken Dekatnus, a contracted consciousness, he likens it to as if a person was locked away in let's say a building that had no windows and completely sealed off from any light whatsoever. If you took that person and pulled them out into the bright sunshine of daylight, the person couldn't handle it. You couldn't handle it. Remember the movie, you can't handle the truth. They couldn't handle the truth. You couldn't handle it. So, how does Hashem do things? Hashem gives a little crack. So first, Moshe Rabbeinu comes to the people. The revelation of Hashem's power through the Makos, the plagues against the Egyptians. The redemption of Israel through the splitting of the Red Sea, which destroyed the most powerful army in the world as they pursued the Jews fleeing Egypt. The pillar of cloud, which they followed during day. The pillar of fire at night. The revelation at Mount Sinai. All these things are sequential. And once again, there's a constant up and down. There's a constant rising and falling of the Jews. And so therefore, this is the metaphor for how you have to turn a person on to Hashem. How to turn a person on to Torah. How to turn a person on to emes, the truth. Because you can't, if you've been steeped in idolatry and foolishness and wokeism and progressivism and fake Torah and fake Judaism, you can't experience the light of Torah all at once. It's just too bright. It's just too much. So it's la'at. It's slowly, little by little. So the Ma'or says what happens is you make a little crack and you let a little tiny bit of light in. And when the individual inside who's been sealed up in the darkness gets used to that little bit of light, you bust it open a little bit more. And then a little bit more until you make a window. And now, wow! Then you make a doorway and you take the guy out into the open sunshine. And that's the metaphor and that's the game plan for how Torah has to be revealed. It has to be sequentially, little by little. And today, so many Jews are just so subsumed in the darkness of the secular culture of today, which is a very wicked secular culture. Remember, today the establishment are wicked leftists who want to tell you once again that a boy could be a girl could be a boy, that everything is based upon skin color, giving a false history of this country, the United States of America. We find for the first time ever, the Gallup poll showed that for the first time ever, the majority of Jews are sympathetic to the fake Palestinians. There is no such thing as Palestinians, they're called fake Palestinians. The fake Palestinians rather than the Jews in Israel. And that because the majority of Jews are Democrats, like some 70 or 80%, that's what really, almost all Democrats are hostile to Israel, even Jews. We know today because in Israel, in Israel it's just the opposite actually. In Israel, overwhelmingly, they elected a right-wing religious government, and they want to reform. That's the correct use of the word reform. You can't reform Judaism. You reform criminals, or you reform things that there's something wrong with. The reform movement, just the fact that they wanted to reform Judaism, just shows how wicked they were, because Yiddishkeit is emes, Judaism is emes, is truth. You don't reform the truth. You only reform wickedness. So in Israel, Israel has a judicial dictatorship in the state of Israel. Unlike here, even with what's going wrong in this country, at least in terms of format, in this country, you have this balance of powers between the different sections of the government. You have a executive, judicial, and legislative branch, and there's counterweights to each of them, at least in theory. And so therefore, then there's a thing called a constitution. Now, we Jewish people, our real constitution is the Torah. So the state of Israel, though, it reflects that in a way, that's the hand of God behind the scenes, that there's no official constitution of Israel. There's something called a basic law, but basically there's a basic law, but what really happened is the leftists who were instrumental in, once again, we'll talk about why the leftists were instrumental in setting up the state of Israel, the hidden hand of Hashem behind the scenes, because we can't do everything in one session here today. But in Israel, they have the judicial branch controls everything, because the legislature might have been elected by the people, and the left actually is a very small minority in Israel, but they control, once again, there's a deep state here in America, there's a deep state in Israel, the administrative state, they control all that, and they control the court. And the court, here in the United States, to get on the Supreme Court, at least the way it's supposed to work, a president, even a fake president, a president gets to nominate somebody to fill a position on the Supreme Court, and that individual has to be confirmed by the Senate. In Israel, the leftist judges just get to appoint other leftist judges, and they appoint something called an attorney general, which, unlike in this country, the attorney general works for whoever is sitting in the White House, is the head of something called the Justice Department. In our time, it should be called the Injustice Department, but that's also for another session. And in Israel, though, the Attorney General works as kind of a bully and an enforcer for the leftist court to disallow what the government that's been elected by the people wants to do. So that's what the judicial reform in Israel is about. And because the people elected a government that wants to truly reform that wicked system, the left is upset because they don't like to lose power. And so once again, the Jews in the United States, most of them affiliate with the Democratic Party, which is really run by communists. And the left is united throughout the world to try to destroy anything that is good, anything that's based on any kind of appreciation that there is a God or there is true morality and that there is truth, actually. That's what the left opposes. So American Jews, who are a tool of the Democrat Party, which is part of a globalist movement of totalitarianism, so they are opposed to any of these reforms in Israel. And so therefore they're all up in arms. And so today there are confusative rabbis in their temples who are now refusing to say the prayer for the state of Israel because they're angry that they say that these reforms are going to destroy democracy. Well, obviously it's just the opposite. There's a judicial dictatorship. But once again, democracy itself isn't that great. The Torah doesn't prescribe democracy, and democracy is really two wolves and a sheep voting on what they have for dinner. But anyway, getting back to our Torah portion. So we see that today the majority of Jews in America and in most places in the world are totally steeped in the darkness of the most wicked aspects of our secular culture today. And that secular culture is what rules the fake movements of Judaism. And so therefore they're totally steeped in darkness. And if they get any light of Torah, could be blinding to them. So we have to be very patient. We have to realize if you're watching this on YouTube or on Rumble or whatever else you're watching this on, wherever I'm going to post this, we all, if you're interested in this and you are in line with some of the things that I'm saying here, you probably are like me. At some point, you weren't where you are today, and you had to be turned on to the light of Torah. But if it was too bright all at once, you would have probably shunned it. So therefore, once you taste the little Torah, real Torah is delicious, and you can't get enough of it. You can't get enough of it. You just want more and more and more. So once you're in that place, you could have more and more light. And we have to understand that most people today aren't in that place. So the message for this week's Torah portion is we have to have what's called a Havas Yisrael. We have a mitzvah of loving our fellow Jew. We also have a mitzvah of Havas Abrius. We have to love all of humanity also. Remember, every human being has an integral worth. Every human being is created with Tzelem V'Demus Elohim. Every human being is created in the image and likeness of God. That means every human being has value and has a purpose to their life in this world. It might be twisted by corrupt culture. Corrupt culture and ideology takes people away from what their true mission in life is. So we have to be patient with our fellow Jews. We have to be patient with people also. That doesn't mean being patient doesn't mean you cover up the truth and you say things that aren't true and you dilute from the truth. But you just have to give the truth in a way that it could be absorbed by people, that it could be handled, that you just can't blind the person. So that's our message today, that we have to step forward and give the message of the Torah to our fellow Jews. And remember, Torah's for the whole world also. There's 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach. There's 7 mitzvahs for all of humanity to guide the whole world. The Torah is meant for the guidance of all of humanity. The Torah is emes. Torah is emes. So that's our message for today. I wish everybody a good Shabbos, or a Shabbat Shalom. We prefer that, but I'm a good Shabbos guy. I'm a good Shabbos! You can't just say good Shabbos. It has to be a good Shabbos! So once again, you're welcome to join me on my Zoom services. If I can get this thing out in time before Shabbos, I'll get it out after Shabbos. Join me for the next Shabbos. You can do Shabbos services with me on Zoom and give everybody a big good Shabbos. You got to do it with enthusiasm, with hislavos, with enthusiasm. You can't just be a little good Shabbos. That's not good enough. Or if you prefer, a Shabbat Shalom is good also. That's going wonderful. And here's Shnuzzy coming, my kitty cat, coming to give me a good Shabbos also. So I wish everybody a good Shabbos and shine forth with the light of Torah, but do it in a way that people will just be illuminated by it, and it won't repel them. It'll bring them closer. And everybody, once again, I wish everybody a beautiful, good Shabbos, and thank you for joining me for some Torah learning.